Barren Worn Hearts. Josephine Josie Tate had spent years avoiding trouble, but when Jack Slade stepped into her saloon, all rough hands and knowing smirks, she knew she was staring it in the face. He leaned in close, voice smooth as whiskey. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I just might take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. A shadow across the sun-drenched plains. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the warped wooden sign above Josie's saloon, the Desert Rose. It creaked a mournful tune in the hot wind, a sound Josie had long since stopped hearing. Years of scorching summers and biting winters had weathered the sign, much like they had weathered her. At 57, Josephine Tate was no wilting flower. Life on the frontier had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving behind only the raw, unyielding core. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to the delicate work of needlepoint, were now calloused, more familiar with the weight of a Colt peacemaker than a thimble. Her reflection in the dusty window showed the story etched on her face, lines around eyes that had seen too much, a mouth that had learned to hold its secrets close, and a jaw set with a stubbornness that had kept her alive in a land that chewed up and spat out the weak. The saloon was quiet this early in the day. Only a few regulars occupied their usual spots, nursing watered-down whiskey and swapping tales of hardship and near misses. Old Man Hemlock, perched precariously on a stool, was recounting, for the 100th time, his encounter with a band of Apaches back in '78. Josie knew the story by heart, every embellishment, every dramatic pause. It was a comfort, in its own way, this familiar rhythm of life in Redemption, Arizona. A town clinging to existence on the edge of nowhere, populated by dreamers, drifters, and those with nowhere else to run. Josie herself had run here, 20 years ago, seeking refuge from a past she couldn't outrun, a past that clung to her like the desert dust that coated everything. She'd built the Desert Rose from the ground up, pouring her sweat and tears into every board, every nail. It was more than just a saloon, it was her sanctuary, her fortress, her penance. She traded a life of privilege in Boston for this harsh, unforgiving landscape, swapping silk gowns for sturdy denim and the scent of roses for the pungent aroma of stale beer and gunpowder. A hawk circled lazily overhead, a dark silhouette against the blindingly blue sky. Josie watched it, a familiar ache in her chest. Freedom. That's what the hawk represented. A freedom she craved, yet knew she could never truly have. The past had a way of casting a long shadow, no matter how far you ran. The creak of the saloon door shattered the quiet. Josie's hand instinctively moved towards the Colt tucked into the waistband of her skirt, a reflex honed by years of living on the edge. She relaxed slightly as she recognized the tall, lean figure silhouetted in the doorway. Sheriff Brody, his weathered face creased with concern. "Morning, Josie," he said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over rowdy crowds and desert winds. He removed his hat, revealing a thinning patch of gray hair. "Brody," Josie replied, her voice neutral. "What brings you here so early? Trouble brewing?" He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Always is, Josie. Always is. Got word of a new gang riding through. The Crimson Vultures. Mean bunch, from what I hear. Led by a fella named Slade. Jack Slade." The name hit Josie like a physical blow. A cold wave of dread washed over her, stealing the breath from her lungs. The world seemed to tilt, the familiar sounds of the saloon fading into a distant hum. Jack Slade. The name echoed in her mind, a ghost from a past she thought she'd buried. A past she had desperately tried to forget. Brody continued, oblivious to her inner turmoil. "They're known for their ruthlessness. Robbing stagecoaches, banks, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. I'm warning everyone to be extra cautious. Lock your doors, keep your guns close." Josie managed a tight nod, her throat constricting. "I appreciate the warning, Brody." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed with concern. "You all right, Josie? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a bit tired, Brody," she lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Long night." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. He knew better than to pry into Josie's business. Everyone in Redemption had secrets. It was the unspoken code of the frontier. "Just be careful, Josie," he repeated, his voice heavy with warning. He placed his hat back on his head, the shadow of the brim obscuring his eyes. "This Slade, he's not someone to be trifled with." He turned and walked out, the saloon doors swinging shut behind him, leaving Josie alone with her racing heart and the chilling echo of a name that threatened to unravel everything she had built. The hawk was gone, replaced by a gathering darkness on the horizon. A storm was coming, and Josie knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this storm had a name: Jack Slade. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, built brick by painstaking brick over 2 decades, felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the encroaching shadow of the past. A past she had shared, in a stolen, reckless moment of youth, with the very man who now haunted the edges of her hard-won peace. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dusty Twilight. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Josie moved through her routine like a ghost, pouring drinks, wiping down the bar, exchanging meaningless pleasantries with her customers. But her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a swirling vortex of memories she had fought so hard to suppress. Jack Slade. The name conjured images she had tried to erase, his dark, intense eyes that seemed to see straight through her, the roguish grin that could melt the coldest heart, the touch of his calloused hand on hers, sending shivers down her spine. She remembered the girl she had been, young and naive, swept away by his charm and the dangerous allure of a life lived on the edge. He was a drifter, a gambler, a man with no ties and no future. She was the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant, destined for a life of comfort and privilege. Their worlds were never meant to collide, yet they had, briefly, explosively, like 2 stars colliding in the vast expanse of the night sky. A stolen kiss, under the cloak of a moonless night, a whispered promise of forever, a hasty, ill-fated elopement that ended in betrayal and heartbreak. She had loved him with the fierce, unyielding passion of youth, and he had betrayed her, leaving her alone and heartbroken, her reputation in tatters, her future uncertain. She had fled west, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild her shattered life. She had buried her past, along with her heart, under the scorching Arizona sun. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the saloon began to fill up. Miners, ranchers, cowboys, and the occasional traveling salesman, all seeking solace in a bottle and the fleeting companionship of strangers. The air grew thick with smoke and the murmur of conversations, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Josie watched them, these men with their rough hands and weathered faces, their lives etched with hardship and resilience. She envied their simplicity, their ability to live in the present, unburdened by the ghosts of the past. A group of cowboys at a corner table were engaged in a heated discussion about a recent cattle rustling incident. Josie overheard snippets of their conversation, words like outlaws, ambush, and revenge floating through the smoky air. The Crimson Vultures, no doubt. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Suddenly, the saloon doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned towards the entrance, where a group of men stood silhouetted against the fading light. They were strangers, their faces hard and unreadable, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory intensity. Josie's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of dread. She knew, without a doubt, who they were. The leader stepped forward, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He was tall and lean, with a ruggedly handsome face framed by dark, unruly hair. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, met Josie's across the room, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. It was him, Jack Slade. 20 years had passed, but time had only enhanced his dangerous allure. He was older, harder, his face etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge, but the spark in his eyes, the hint of rebellion in his smile, remained unchanged. He looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, a look that stripped away her defenses and laid bare the vulnerability she had tried so hard to conceal. He moved towards the bar, his spurs clinking on the wooden floor, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of his footsteps. The other men followed, their hands hovering near their holstered guns, their eyes watchful and wary. The tension in the saloon was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear. He stopped in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. He leaned in close, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent shivers down her spine. "Josephine," he said, his voice smooth as whiskey, the name a caress and a threat all in one. "It's been a long time." Josie forced herself to meet his gaze, her own eyes narrowed and defiant. She refused to show him any weakness, any sign of the turmoil raging inside her. "Slade," she replied, her voice cold and steady, betraying none of the emotions that threatened to consume her. "What brings you to my saloon?" His smile widened, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Just passing through, sweetheart. Thought I'd stop in for a drink and maybe catch up with an old friend." The words were laced with a subtle mockery, a reminder of their shared past, a past she had tried so hard to forget. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of years of silence and regret hanging heavy between them. The whispers began, swirling around them like the desert dust, a chorus of speculation and fear. Everyone in the saloon knew the name Jack Slade, and they knew what it meant. Trouble. Big trouble. And Josie knew that his arrival and redemption meant the end of the fragile peace she had so carefully cultivated. The quiet life, the anonymity. They vanished with his arrival, as quickly as a desert mirage. Chapter 3. The Serpent's Bargain in a Desert Town. Josie held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We're not friends, Slade. We never were." The words were sharp, like shards of glass, meant to wound, to keep him at a distance. But she knew, deep down, that they were a lie. They had been something once, something intense, something passionate, something that had burned brightly and then crashed and burned, leaving behind only ashes and regret. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver of unease through the room. "Now, Josie, that's not how I remember it. We had some memorable times, didn't we?" His eyes flickered with a hint of something that might have been nostalgia, or perhaps just amusement at her discomfort. Josie's hand tightened around the bottle of whiskey she was holding, her knuckles turning white. "Get out, Slade," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're not welcome here." He raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Now, is that any way to treat an old acquaintance? Especially one who's come bearing gifts?" He gestured towards one of his men, who stepped forward and placed a heavy sack on the bar. The thud of the sack echoed in the silent room. Josie looked at it with suspicion, her eyes narrowed. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. Slade grinned, a flash of white teeth against his tan skin. "A little something to smooth things over. Let's call it a peace offering." Josie knew better than to trust him. She had learned that lesson the hard way, 20 years ago. His gifts always came with a price, a hidden agenda, a serpent lurking beneath the shiny surface. She gestured towards the sack with a nod of her head. "Open it." One of Slade's men, a burly brute with a scar across his cheek, untied the sack and upended it. Gold coins spilled onto the bar, gleaming in the dim light. A collective gasp went up from the onlookers. It was a small fortune, enough to buy the saloon several times over. Josie stared at the gold, her mind racing. It was a bribe, of course. But for what? What did he want from her? She looked back at Slade, her eyes searching his. "What's the catch, Slade?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "I need your help, Josie. I need information." She scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "Information? From me? You think I know anything that would be of interest to you?" He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, I think you do, sweetheart. I think you know a lot more than you let on. You always were good at keeping secrets." His words were a veiled threat, a reminder of the secrets they shared, the secrets that bound them together, whether she liked it or not. He knew about her past, about her life before redemption, about the reasons she had run. He knew her vulnerabilities, her weaknesses. And he was using them against her. He continued, his voice low and persuasive. There's a shipment coming through. Gold, from the mines up north. I need to know when, where, and how it's being transported. You have connections, Josie. You know people. You can get me that information. Josie's mind reeled. He wanted her to betray her town, her friends, the people who had trusted her, who had given her a second chance. He wanted her to become a traitor, to side with the very outlaws who threatened to destroy everything she had built. It was unthinkable. Impossible. And yet a part of her, a small, dark part that she had tried to suppress, felt a flicker of excitement, a thrill at the prospect of being involved in something dangerous, something forbidden. It was the same part of her that had been drawn to him 20 years ago, the part that craved the adrenaline rush of living on the edge. She looked at the gold on the bar, then back at Slade. His eyes were intense, unwavering, holding her captive. He was offering her a choice, a chance to return to the life she had left behind, a life of excitement and danger, a chance to be with him again. The offer hung in the air, a serpent's promise, tempting and deadly, to betray the town or to betray the ghost of what they'd once shared. Both choices were fraught with a danger all their own. She took a deep breath, the scent of whiskey and gunpowder filling her lungs. Her decision was made, but the consequences, she knew, would ripple through the fragile piece of redemption like a shockwave. Chapter 4. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. I'll do it, Josie said, her voice surprisingly steady. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A collective gasp rippled through the saloon, followed by a stunned silence. Even Slade seemed momentarily surprised by her quick acquiescence. His eyes narrowed, searching hers, trying to gauge her sincerity. He had expected resistance, a fight, perhaps even a refusal. He hadn't expected her to agree so readily. You will? He asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Josie nodded, her gaze unwavering. But on my terms. He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. And what are your terms, sweetheart? The information is yours, she said, her voice low and firm. But no one gets hurt. No bloodshed in redemption. This town, these people, they're under my protection. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. Protection? You think you can protect them from me, Josie? I can try, she replied, her voice unwavering. And I will. That's my condition. Take it or leave it. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing, calculating. He saw the steel in her gaze, the determination in her stance. He knew she wasn't bluffing. She was a different woman from the naive girl he had known 20 years ago. She was harder, stronger, more resilient. And she was dangerous. He finally nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. All right, Josie. We have a deal. No bloodshed and redemption. But if anyone interferes, if anyone tries to stop us, all bets are off. She met his gaze, her eyes cold and hard. Agreed. He extended his hand, his palm open, offering a truce. Josie hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over his. The touch of his skin, even after all these years, sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a reminder of their past, of the passion that had once burned between them, a passion that had been extinguished by betrayal and regret. She finally took his hand, her grip firm and unwavering. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who had lived a hard life. The handshake was brief, a formal acknowledgement of their agreement, but the undercurrent of tension between them was palpable. When I have the information, I will leave a message at the usual spot, she said, her voice regaining its coolness. The old oak tree, by the river? He asked, and with a subtle smile and a nod from Josie, he continued. Good. He smiled. I knew I could count on you, sweetheart. He turned to leave. Until then. He and his men walked out of the saloon, their spurs clinking on the wooden floor, leaving behind a stunned silence and a room filled with the scent of gunpowder and the heavy weight of unspoken fears. Josie watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made a deal with the devil, and she knew that the consequences would be far-reaching. The silence was broken by Old Man Hemlock, his voice trembling. "Josie, what have you done?" She turned to face him, her expression grim. "I did what I had to do, Hemlock. To protect this town. To protect all of you." But even as she said the words, she knew that she was lying, at least in part. She had done it to protect redemption, yes, but she had also done it for herself. For a chance to feel alive again, to escape the suffocating monotony of her life, to recapture a flicker of the passion she had thought long dead. She had done it for Jack Slade. As the night wore on and the saloon slowly emptied, Josie found herself alone, staring at the pile of gold coins on the bar. They gleamed in the dim light, a constant reminder of the bargain she had struck, the dangerous game she was now playing. She poured herself a drink, the whiskey burning a familiar path down her throat. She thought of the past, of the girl she had been, of the choices she had made, of the mistakes that had led her here. She thought of Jack Slade, of the man he had become, of the dangerous allure he still held over her. And she wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The echoes of their shared past, mingled with the imagined sounds of future gunfire, filled the silence of the empty saloon. A storm was brewing, and she was caught right in the heart of it. A choice made, a future hanging in the balance. Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of a million stars. The following days passed in a haze of anxious anticipation. Josie went through the motions of her daily routine, running the saloon, tending to her customers, but her mind was constantly elsewhere, replaying her conversation with Slade, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for any hint of deception. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between loyalty and betrayal, between the life she had built and the ghost of a life she had left behind. She found herself drawn to the outskirts of town, to the old oak tree by the river, the place where she was supposed to leave the information for Slade. It was a secluded spot, hidden from prying eyes, a place where they had once shared stolen moments, whispered secrets, and promises that were never kept. The memories flooded back, vivid and bittersweet, a reminder of a time when life had seemed simpler, when love had felt like the only thing that mattered. The landscape surrounding Redemption was starkly beautiful, a vast expanse of rolling hills, rugged canyons, and endless blue sky. The air was dry and clean, scented with the fragrance of sagebrush and pine. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the rustle of the wind through the dry grasses. It was a landscape that demanded respect, a landscape that could both nurture and destroy. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Josie found herself standing beneath the oak tree, her hand resting on its rough bark. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking spectacle of orange, pink, and purple hues. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cool evening air, trying to calm the turmoil within her. A sound behind her made her turn. It was Sheriff Brody, his face creased with concern. He had been watching her, she realized, following her. "Josie," he said, his voice gentle. "What are you doing out here?" She hesitated, unsure of what to say. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice evasive. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. He knew her well, knew that she was hiding something. "You've been different lately, Josie. Distant. Preoccupied. Is everything all right?" She forced a smile, trying to reassure him. "I'm fine, Brody. Just a bit tired, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. He knew better than to pry into her personal affairs. He respected her privacy, her right to keep her secrets. "Just be careful, Josie," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "Slade and his gang, they're dangerous. I don't want to see you get hurt." His words were a reminder of the risk she was taking, the danger she was courting. She knew he was right, but she couldn't back down now. She had made a commitment, a promise, and she intended to keep it. "I appreciate your concern, Brody," she said, her voice sincere. "But I can handle myself." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know you can, Josie. You're the strongest woman I know. But even the strongest can fall." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone beneath the darkening sky. His words echoed in her mind, a chilling premonition of what might lie ahead. She looked up at the sky, now a deep indigo, studded with 1,000,000 stars. They seemed to twinkle down at her, distant and indifferent, offering no guidance, no solace. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling she had become accustomed to over the years. She had built a wall around her heart, protecting herself from further pain, further betrayal. But now, that wall was crumbling, threatened by the reemergence of Jack Slade, the man who had shattered it once before. She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She whispered a prayer to the uncaring stars, a plea for strength, for guidance, for a way out of the tangled web she had woven for herself. The vastness of the night, the silence of the desert, amplified her isolation. She was alone, caught between the shadows of her past and the uncertainties of her future, beneath a sky that offered no answers, only the cold, hard truth of her predicament. She had a choice to make, and she was running out of time. Chapter 6. The Dance of Shadows and Desire. Josie finally obtained the information Slade wanted. It had taken days of discreet inquiries, subtle questioning, and leveraging old favors. She had tapped into the network of contacts she had carefully cultivated over the years, the miners, the ranchers, the stagecoach drivers, the people who knew the comings and goings of everything that moved through the territory. The gold shipment was scheduled to leave Fort Defiance in 3 days, traveling along the old Butterfield Trail, a treacherous route through the mountains. It would be heavily guarded, but Slade was confident he could intercept it, with the right information. Josie wrote down the details on a piece of paper, her hand trembling slightly. She knew that this information could lead to violence, to bloodshed, to the deaths of innocent men. She felt a heavy weight of responsibility, a guilt that gnawed at her conscience. But she had made a deal, and she would honor it, even if it meant betraying her own principles. She rode out to the oak tree under the cover of darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. The moon was a sliver in the sky, providing just enough light to see by. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the hooting of an owl in the distance. She reached the tree and tucked the note into a hollow in its trunk, the same place where she and Slade had once left messages for each other, years ago. A wave of nostalgia washed over her, a bittersweet memory of a time when life had seemed simpler, when love had felt like the only thing that mattered. As she turned to leave, she heard a sound behind her. She whirled around, her hand reaching for the Colt tucked into her waistband. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and lean, his features obscured by the darkness. It was Slade. "Josie," he said, his voice a low murmur. She relaxed slightly, her hand dropping from her gun.
"Slade.
"You startled me." He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight.
I didn't mean to."
"I just wanted to thank you." "There's no need for thanks," she said, her voice cool. "We had a deal. I kept my end of the bargain." "You did," he agreed. "And I appreciate it. More than you know." He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers gently caressing her skin. A shiver ran through her, a response she hadn't expected. She pulled away, breaking the contact. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't pretend that this is anything more than what it is. A business transaction. Nothing more." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart race. "Is that what you really believe, Josie? After all these years?" She met his gaze, her own eyes narrowed and defiant. "That's all it can be, Slade. We can't go back. We can't undo the past." "Maybe not," he said, his voice soft. "But we can create a new future. Together." His words were a temptation, a siren song luring her towards the rocks of danger and desire. She had tried to deny it, to suppress it, but the attraction between them was still there, as strong as ever. It was a dangerous dance, a dance of shadows and desire, a dance that could lead to her destruction. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of leather and gunpowder that clung to him. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I never forgot you, Josie," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "Not for a single day." His words were a balm to her wounded heart, a soothing whisper that eased the pain of years of loneliness and regret. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the feelings that were surging through her. But she knew she couldn't. He was an outlaw, a criminal, a man who lived by his own rules. She was a saloon owner, a woman who had built a life of respectability and hard-won peace. Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent. And yet as she looked into his eyes, she saw something there, something that made her heart ache with a longing she had thought long dead. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of regret, a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man she had once loved. The dance continued, the pull between them growing stronger, the shadows deepening, the desire burning brighter. The line between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal, blurred in the moonlit darkness. It was a dangerous game, and she was losing herself in it, one stolen moment at a time. Chapter 7. A truth etched in scars and silence. Josie pushed him away, her hands flat against his chest. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the raw, untamed passion that had once consumed them. "Don't, Jack," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is wrong." "We can't." He didn't release her, his hands lingering on her waist, his eyes searching hers. "Can't what, Josie? Can't feel? Can't remember? Can't want?" His words were a direct challenge, a stripping away of the pretense that had shielded her for so long. He saw through her defenses, saw the vulnerability she had tried so hard to conceal. He knew the effect he had on her, and he wasn't afraid to use it. She closed her eyes, struggling to regain control of her emotions. "We can't change the past, Jack," she whispered. "What happened had happened. We made our choices." "Choices that were forced upon us," he said, his voice low and intense. "Choices that were made by others, not by us." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, his expression shifting, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "There are things you don't know, Josie. Things about that night, about why I left." Her heart quickened. She had always believed that he had simply abandoned her, that he had never truly loved her. But now, hearing the raw emotion in his voice, seeing the pain in his eyes, she wondered if she had been wrong. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the ground. He seemed to be struggling with himself, wrestling with a decision that weighed heavily upon him. Finally, he looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "Your father," he began, his voice rough. He paid me to leave. He offered me a substantial sum of money to disappear, to never contact you again. He said you were better off without me, that I would ruin your life." Josie stared at him, stunned. Her father? The man she had always admired, the man who had always seemed so loving and protective? It couldn't be true. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice shaking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to him, in her father's handwriting. She recognized the familiar script, the distinctive flourishes. Her hands trembled as she took the letter, her eyes scanning the words. It was all there in black and white. Her father's offer, his threats, his insistence that Jack was not good enough for her, that he would only bring her shame and unhappiness. He had offered Jack a choice: take the money and disappear, or face the consequences, which included fabricated charges and a lengthy prison sentence. Josie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her whole world had been turned upside down. The man she had trusted, the man who had raised her, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. He had manipulated her, controlled her, destroyed her chance at happiness. And Jack, he had taken the money. He had left her. But now, understanding the circumstances, she saw his actions in a new light. He had been forced into an impossible situation, given a choice between his freedom and her love. He had chosen his freedom, but not out of a lack of love, but rather out of a desperate attempt to survive. The truth, etched in the faded ink of the letter and the silent scars of their shared past, was finally revealed. It was a truth that shattered her illusions, but also, paradoxically, offered a glimmer of hope. A hope for understanding, for forgiveness, for perhaps even a second chance. The weight of 20 years of misunderstanding began to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative possibility. But the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, in the dangers of the present, and the echoes of the past that refused to be silenced. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom on a Barren Frontier. Josie looked up at Jack, tears streaming down her face. The anger, the resentment, the bitterness she had carried for 20 years began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of sadness, of loss, of wasted years. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached out and gently wiped away her tears, his touch tender, hesitant. "I tried, Josie. I wrote to you several times. But my letters never reached you. Your father intercepted them, I suspect. He made sure you never knew the truth." She closed her eyes, the pain overwhelming. Her father had not only betrayed her, he had also stolen her chance to know the truth, to understand, to perhaps forgive. He had condemned her to a life of bitterness and regret, all in the name of protecting her, of preserving his own social standing. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice trembling. He pulled her close, holding her tightly, his arms a haven of comfort and support. She leaned into him, her body shaking with sobs. He stroked her hair, murmuring soothing words, his voice filled with a tenderness she had never expected to hear from him again. "It's all right, Josie," he whispered. "It's all right. I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." His words, his presence, offered a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. But even as she clung to him, a part of her remained skeptical, wary. He was still an outlaw, a man with a price on his head. He was still involved in a dangerous game, a game that could cost them both their lives. After a long moment, she pulled away, wiping her eyes. "The gold shipment," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "It leaves in 3 days. You have the information. You should go." He shook his head, his eyes intense. "Not without you." She stared at him, surprised.
"What?"
"I'm not leaving you again, Josie," he said, his voice firm. "Not this time. I made that mistake once. I won't make it again. But your gang, the robbery," he waved his hand dismissively. "They can manage without me. I'm done with that life, Josie. I'm done running." She searched his eyes, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of insincerity. But she saw only honesty, a raw, vulnerable honesty that mirrored her own. "What are you saying, Jack?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm saying I want another chance, Josie. With you. I want to start over, to build a new life, together. Here in Redemption or anywhere else you want to go." His words were a dream come true, a fantasy she had long since abandoned. But they were also a terrifying prospect, a leap of faith into the unknown. Could she trust him? Could she risk her heart again, after it had been broken so badly? She looked at him, at the lines of hardship etched on his face, at the glimmer of hope in his eyes, at the scars that told a story of a life lived on the edge. And she realized that she had already made her decision. She had made it the moment she saw him again, the moment she felt the spark of attraction, the flicker of recognition, the undeniable pull that had always existed between them. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, Jack. I want that too." A smile spread across his face, a smile that lit up his eyes and transformed his features, making him look younger, more carefree, like the man she had fallen in love with 20 years ago. He pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, their second chance. The price of freedom on this barren frontier was high. It demanded courage, resilience, and a willingness to take risks. But for Josie and Jack, it was a price they were both willing to pay, for a chance to reclaim the love they had lost, to build a future together, beneath the vast, unforgiving sky of the Arizona desert. The future was uncertain, the dangers were real, but for the first time in a long time, Josie felt a sense of hope, a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. She was home. The decision, made under a sky full of stars, marked a turning point. But the echoes of their past, and the realities of their present, still loomed, casting long shadows over their newfound hope. Chapter 9. Where Rivers Run Red with Secrets. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparations. Josie and Jack knew they couldn't stay in Redemption. Slade's gang would eventually realize he wasn't coming back, and they wouldn't be happy. Sheriff Brody, while sympathetic to Josie, would be obligated to arrest Jack if he stayed. They needed to disappear, to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere far away from the reach of both the law and the outlaws. Josie closed down the Desert Rose, much to the shock and dismay of her regulars. She told them she was moving on, seeking a new life, a new adventure. She didn't tell them the truth, of course. She couldn't risk exposing Jack or herself. She sold the saloon to Old Man Hemlock, who had always dreamed of owning it for a fraction of its worth. It was a bittersweet farewell, a parting with a place that had been her refuge, her sanctuary, for so many years. They packed their belongings, a meager collection of clothes, personal items, and the few treasures they had accumulated over the years. Josie took the Colt Peacemaker, a reminder of her resilience, her strength. Jack had his own guns, his constant companions in a life lived on the edge. They decided to head west, towards California, a land of promise, a land of new beginnings. They planned to travel by night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the less traveled trails. It would be a dangerous journey, fraught with risks, but they were determined to make it. On their last night in Redemption, they stood outside the darkened saloon, looking back at the town that had been their home, their prison, their salvation. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the dusty streets, the weathered buildings, the silent landscape. "Are you sure about this, Josie?" Jack asked, his voice low. "Leaving everything behind? Starting over?" She turned to him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I'm sure," she said, her voice firm. "I'm with you, Jack. That's all that matters." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that warmed her heart. He pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and reassuring, a promise of a future together, a future they would build, brick by brick, on the foundation of their love and their shared experiences. They rode out of Redemption under the cover of darkness, two figures on horseback, silhouetted against the vast expanse of the night sky. They left behind their past, their secrets, their regrets, and rode towards an uncertain future, a future filled with both danger and hope. As they traveled, they talked, sharing their stories, their dreams, their fears. Josie learned more about Jack's life after he left her, the years he had spent wandering, drifting, trying to escape the pain of their separation. He had joined the Crimson Vultures out of desperation, seeking a sense of belonging, a purpose, a way to survive. But he had never forgotten her, never stopped loving her. Jack, in turn, learned more about Josie's life in Redemption, the hardships she had endured, the struggles she had overcome, the strength she had discovered within herself. He admired her resilience, her courage, her unwavering spirit. They reached the river, the same river where they had once shared stolen moments, whispered secrets. The water flowed swiftly, reflecting the moonlight, a shimmering ribbon of silver in the darkness. They stopped to rest, letting their horses drink. As they sat by the riverbank, Jack pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and took out a silver locket, a delicate piece of jewelry that Josie recognized instantly. "I kept it," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "All these years." A reminder of you, of what we had. Josie took the locket, her fingers tracing its intricate design. It was a heart-shaped locket, with a small portrait of her inside, a portrait taken when she was young, carefree, before the world had hardened her, before the pain of betrayal had etched its lines on her face. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought you had forgotten me," she whispered. He shook his head, his eyes intense. "Never, Josie. Never." He opened the locket again, revealing a tiny inscription on the back of the portrait she hadn't noticed before. "Forever yours." Josie choked back a sob. He fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the feeling of connection, of belonging, of love rediscovered. The river flowed on, carrying their secrets, their hopes, their dreams, towards an unknown destination. Where the waters ran, secrets ran deeper, and their journey had only just begun. The past was behind them, but its echoes still resonated, a reminder of the challenges they had overcome and the challenges that still lay ahead. Chapter 10. The Unforgiving Heart of the West. Their journey westward was arduous, a constant test of their endurance and their resilience. They traveled mostly at night, guided by the stars and Jack's knowledge of the terrain. They avoided towns and settlements, sticking to the back roads and trails, always wary of being seen, of being recognized. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert, mountains, and canyons. The days were scorching hot, the nights bitterly cold. They faced sandstorms, rattlesnakes, and the constant threat of running out of water. But they persevered, driven by their determination to reach California, to start a new life, together. One evening, as they were camped in a secluded canyon, they were caught in a sudden downpour. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent. They huddled together under a rocky overhang, shivering in the cold, their clothes soaked through. "We should have stayed in Redemption," Josie said, her teeth chattering. "At least we would have had a roof over our heads." Jack put his arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll be all right, Josie. We'll get through this."
We always do.
His words, his presence, offered a small measure of comfort, a reminder of their strength, their resilience. They had faced hardship before, and they had survived. They would survive this too. As the storm raged, they talked, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams. Josie confessed her doubts, her anxieties about starting over, about leaving everything behind. Jack reassured her, promising to protect her, to provide for her, to build a life with her that was worthy of her love and her sacrifices. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a clear, star-studded sky. The air was fresh and clean, washed clean by the rain. They built a fire, drying their clothes and warming themselves by the flames. As they sat by the fire, Jack told Josie more about his past, about his childhood, about the events that had shaped him into the man he had become. He had grown up in poverty, his father a drunkard, his mother a victim of abuse. He had learned to survive on the streets, to fight for what he needed, to trust no one. He had joined the Crimson Vultures out of desperation, seeking a sense of belonging, a family, a way to escape the misery of his life. Josie listened, her heart aching for the young boy he had been, the boy who had never had a chance, the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, to harden his heart against the world. She understood, now, the source of his anger, his rebelliousness, his cynicism. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "I'm sorry for what you went through." He shrugged, his expression stoic. "It is what it is, Josie. I can't change the past, but I can change the future, and I want to change it with you." His words, his vulnerability, touched her deeply. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts connected by a bond of shared experience, of shared pain, of shared hope. The unforgiving heart of the West, with its harsh landscapes and brutal realities, had tested them, challenged them, but it had also brought them closer, strengthening their bond, deepening their love. They were survivors, two souls forged in the crucible of hardship, two hearts beating as one, against the odds. The journey was far from over, but they faced it together, their hands clasped, their spirits intertwined, their love a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They had found each other again, in the heart of the storm, and that was all that mattered. The trials of the journey, though harsh, were forging a bond stronger than either had known before. The future was still uncertain, but they had each other, and that was enough. Chapter 11. A promise broken, a spirit tested. They had been traveling for weeks, making slow but steady progress towards California. They had managed to avoid any major encounters, slipping past settlements and patrols like shadows in the night. But their luck was about to run out. One evening, as they were riding through a narrow pass in the mountains, they were ambushed. A volley of gunshots rang out, echoing through the canyon. Josie felt a sharp pain in her shoulder and cried out, losing her grip on the reins. Her horse reared, throwing her to the ground. Jack reacted instantly, drawing his guns and returning fire. He managed to take down two of the attackers, but there were too many. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He saw Josie lying on the ground, her face pale, her eyes closed.
Josie,
he shouted, his voice filled with panic. He dismounted, rushing to her side. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. She was alive, but unconscious. The bullet had grazed her shoulder, leaving a bloody gash. It wasn't life-threatening, but she needed medical attention, fast. He looked up, scanning the surrounding cliffs. The attackers were still there, hidden among the rocks, their guns trained on him. He was trapped, pinned down. He couldn't fight them off and tend to Josie at the same time. He made a decision. He would surrender. He would sacrifice his own freedom to save Josie's life. He raised his hands, his guns dropping to the ground. "Don't shoot," he shouted. "I surrender." The firing stopped. A group of men emerged from the rocks, their faces grim, their guns still trained on him. They were members of the Crimson Vultures, his former gang. They had found him. Their leader, a burly brute named Bear, stepped forward, his eyes filled with contempt. Well, he sneered. "Look what we have here. The prodigal son returns." Jack ignored him, his eyes focused on Josie. "She needs a doctor," he said, his voice urgent. "She's been shot." Bear laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "That's your problem, Slade. Not ours." "She's innocent," Jack pleaded. "She has nothing to do with this." Bear shrugged. "Collateral damage. Happens all the time." Jack's anger flared. He lunged at Bear, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled, exchanging blows, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. But Jack was outnumbered. The other gang members quickly overpowered him, pulling him off Bear and beating him mercilessly. Josie regained consciousness, her head throbbing, her shoulder burning with pain. She saw Jack, lying on the ground, his face bloody and bruised, surrounded by his former comrades. They were going to kill him. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything, to save him. She saw his guns, lying on the ground nearby. She stumbled towards them, her legs weak, her vision blurred. She reached the guns, picking up one of them, her hand shaking. It was heavy, unfamiliar. She had fired it before, but only in practice, never at a human being. Could she do it? Could she kill to save the man she loved? She raised the gun, aiming it at Bear, who was standing over Jack, his foot on his chest, a knife in his hand. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A promise broken, a spirit tested. The ambush had shattered their hopes of escape, their dreams of a new life. Jack had sacrificed himself to save her, and now, she was faced with a choice that would determine their fate, a choice that would test the very limits of her courage, her love, her newly found strength. The echoes of the gunshots still rang in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that surrounded them, the danger that threatened to consume them. The moment hung heavy, the decision hers. Chapter 12. The weight of yesterday's choices. Josie's finger tightened on the trigger, her hand trembling. She stared down the barrel of the gun, her eyes fixed on Bear, the man who was about to take Jack's life. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of fear and desperation. She had never killed anyone before. Could she do it now? Could she take a life to save a life? A voice inside her, a voice she had long suppressed, whispered, "Do it. Save him. He would do the same for you." It was the voice of the woman she had become, the woman who had survived hardship, betrayal, and loss. The woman who had learned to fight, to survive, to protect those she loved. She took a deep breath, steadying her hand. She aimed carefully, her fingers squeezing the trigger. The gun roared, the recoil jarring her injured shoulder. Bear cried out, clutching his chest, his eyes widening in surprise. He stumbled backward, dropping the knife, and collapsed to the ground. The other gang members stared in shock, their faces frozen in disbelief. They had never expected Josie, the saloon owner, the woman they had dismissed as weak and insignificant, to be capable of such violence. Jack, taking advantage of their distraction, rolled away, grabbing his other gun. He fired, taking down 2 more of the attackers. The remaining gang members, realizing they were outmatched, turned and fled, disappearing into the rocks. Silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by Josie's ragged breathing and the groans of the wounded men. Jack crawled over to Josie, his face filled with concern. "Josie, are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She couldn't believe what she had done. She had killed a man. She had taken a life. He pulled her close, holding her tightly. "You saved my life, Josie," he whispered. "You saved my life." She buried her face in his chest, sobbing. The weight of her actions, the horror of what she had done, washed over her. She felt sick, disgusted, ashamed. He stroked her hair, soothing her, his voice gentle. "It's all right, Josie," he said. "It's all right. You did what you had to do.
You protected me.
You protected us." His words, his presence, offered a small measure of comfort, a lifeline in the sea of her guilt and fear. She clung to him, drawing strength from his embrace. They tended to their wounds, bandaging Josie's shoulder and Jack's cuts and bruises. They buried Bear and the other dead gang members, a grim task that served as a stark reminder of the violence they had both experienced, the violence they had both inflicted. As they sat by the smoldering embers of their campfire, Josie looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "I never wanted to be this person, Jack," she whispered. "I never wanted to be a killer." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You're not a killer, Josie," he said. "You're a survivor. You did what you had to do. And I'm proud of you." His words, his understanding, helped to ease the burden of her guilt, to soothe the turmoil in her soul. She knew that she would never be the same, that the experience had changed her irrevocably. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Jack, and together, they would face the future, whatever it held. The weight of yesterday's choices, the burden of their past, hung heavy upon them. But they had each other, and that was enough to give them the strength to carry on, to keep moving forward, to keep searching for the peace, the happiness, the redemption they so desperately craved. The echoes of the gunfight faded, replaced by the quiet whisper of the wind, a constant reminder of the fragility of life, the ever-present threat of danger, and the enduring power of love. The canyon held its secrets, and they held theirs. The journey continued, marked by violence, but also by courage. Chapter 13. Between the Law and the Outlaw's Heart. They knew they couldn't stay in the canyon. The Crimson Vultures would be back, seeking revenge. They needed to move on, to get as far away as possible. They packed their meager belongings, their horses saddled and ready, and set off once more, their bodies aching, their spirits wounded, but their determination unbroken. They traveled for days, avoiding all contact with civilization, sticking to the most remote trails, their senses on high alert, constantly watching for any sign of pursuit. They were exhausted, hungry, and running low on supplies. One evening, as they were making camp near a small stream, They heard the sound of approaching horses. They quickly doused their fire, grabbing their guns and taking cover behind some rocks. A lone rider emerged from the trees, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. It was Sheriff Brody. Josie and Jack exchanged a look of disbelief. How had he found them? Had he been tracking them all along? Brody rode slowly towards their hiding place, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Josie? Jack? It's me, Brody. I'm alone. They hesitated, unsure of whether to trust him. They knew he was a lawman, and Jack was a wanted man. But they also knew that Brody was a fair man, a man of his word. He had always been kind to Josie, had always treated her with respect. They cautiously emerged from their hiding place, their guns still drawn, but lowered. Brody dismounted, his face creased with concern. Josie, are you all right? I heard about the ambush, about the Crimson Vultures. Josie nodded, her voice hoarse. We're alive, Brody. Thanks to Jack. Brody looked at Jack, his eyes assessing. He knew Jack's reputation, knew he was an outlaw. But he also saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the pain in his face, the love and concern he clearly had for Josie. I'm not here to arrest you, Jack, Brody said, his voice calm. I'm here to help. Jack and Josie exchanged a surprised look. They hadn't expected this.
Why?
Jack asked, his voice suspicious. Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Because Josie is my friend, he said. And because I believe you're not the man they say you are. I believe you've changed. He explained that he had been following the Crimson Vultures for weeks, tracking their movements, trying to bring them to justice. He had learned about their planned ambush of the gold shipment, and he had suspected that Jack might be involved. He had followed Jack and Josie, hoping to intercept them, to warn them. But he had been too late. I know you two are trying to start over, Brody said. And I want to help you do that. I can give you supplies, food, and a head start. I can also look the other way for a while. It was a risky offer, a betrayal of his duty as a lawman. But he was willing to take that risk, for Josie's sake, and for the sake of what he believed was right. Jack and Josie looked at each other, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. They had found an unlikely ally, a friend in a place they least expected it. Thank you, Brody, Josie said, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Brody said, his expression grim. The vultures are still out there. And they'll be looking for you. You need to be careful. Very careful. He gave them supplies, enough food to last them for several weeks, and a map showing a safe route to California, a route that would avoid the main trails and settlements. He also gave them a warning. There's a bounty on your head, Jack, he said. A hefty one. Bounty hunters will be after you. You need to watch your back. Jack nodded, his expression determined. I will, Brody. I will. They said their goodbyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Brody watched them ride off, two figures disappearing into the darkness, their fate uncertain, their future hanging in the balance. He knew he was taking a risk helping them, but he felt it was the right thing to do. Josie and Jack rode on, their hearts heavy with gratitude and a renewed sense of hope. They were still caught between the law and the outlaw's heart, between their past and their future, but they had a chance to escape, a chance to start over. And they were determined to take it. The line between right and wrong, between justice and mercy, had blurred. Brody's actions were a testament to the complexities of the frontier, where the law wasn't always black and white, and where friendship and loyalty could sometimes outweigh duty and obligation. The path ahead was still dangerous, but they had a friend, and they had each other. Chapter 14. A flame in the darkness of deceit. The newfound supplies and Brody's map were a blessing, allowing them to travel with more confidence and a slightly lessened burden. The route was treacherous, winding through desolate canyons and across barren plains, but it was safer, less likely to lead them into encounters with bounty hunters or the remnants of the Crimson Vultures. They traveled for days, their bodies growing accustomed to the rhythm of the journey, their spirits buoyed by the prospect of reaching California, of finally escaping their past. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their communication often reduced to shared glances, knowing nods, and the comforting touch of hands. One evening, as they were camped near a small spring, nestled among a cluster of cottonwood trees, Josie noticed a change in Jack. He was more withdrawn than usual, his eyes clouded with a darkness she hadn't seen in a while. He was restless, pacing back and forth, his hand constantly hovering near his gun. "What is it, Jack?" she asked, her voice concerned. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, his expression troubled. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. "I don't trust Brody," he said, his voice low. Josie was surprised. "What? Why?" "He helped us. He risked his career, his life, to give us a chance." Jack shook his head. "It doesn't make sense, Josie. He's a lawman. Why would he let a wanted man go free? Why would he help us escape?" Josie tried to reason with him. "He's my friend, Jack. He cares about me. He knows I wouldn't be with you if I didn't believe in you." "Maybe he has other motives," Jack insisted. "Maybe he's setting us up. Maybe he's leading us into a trap." Josie felt a flicker of doubt, a seed of suspicion planted in her mind. She had trusted Brody, had believed in his integrity. But Jack's words, his fear, were contagious. She began to question Brody's motives, to wonder if she had been naive, if she had made a mistake. "What do you think he's planning?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack paced, his hand still on his gun. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe he's working with the bounty hunters. Maybe he's planning to collect the reward himself. Or maybe he's still loyal to your father. Maybe he's planning to take you back to Boston." The thought sent a shiver of fear through Josie. The idea of being forced back into her old life, back into the gilded cage she had escaped, was terrifying. "We need to be careful, Josie," Jack said, his voice urgent. "We need to watch our backs. We can't trust anyone." His paranoia, his suspicion, was starting to consume him, to cloud his judgment. Josie knew that fear could be a powerful weapon, a tool that could distort reality, that could lead to irrational decisions. She tried to remain calm, to be the voice of reason. "We'll be careful, Jack," she said. "But we can't let fear control us. We need to trust our instincts. And my instincts tell me that Brody is a good man." But even as she said the words, she felt a knot of doubt tightening in her stomach. The flame of hope that had been rekindled by Brody's help was now flickering, threatened by the darkness of deceit, of suspicion, of the ever-present fear that haunted their journey. They continued their journey, their senses on high alert, their trust shattered, their minds filled with uncertainty. The landscape seemed more menacing, the silence more ominous, the shadows more threatening. They were alone, isolated, caught in a web of their own making, their own fears, their own doubts. The darkness of Jack's suspicion was spreading, threatening to engulf them both, to extinguish the fragile flame of their hope. They were walking a tightrope, balanced between trust and betrayal, between freedom and capture, between a new life and a return to the ghosts of their past. Chapter 15. The Ghosts of What Might Have Been. The seed of doubt that Jack had planted continued to grow, festering in Josie's mind. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit, any hint of betrayal. She started to question everything, every decision they had made, every person they had encountered. Sleep became a luxury. She would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the desert, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She would watch Jack, his face etched with worry, his hand never far from his gun. She saw the fear in his eyes, the doubt that was consuming him, and she wondered if he was right. Had they been foolish to trust Brody? Were they walking into a trap? One day, as they were riding through a narrow canyon, Josie spotted a figure on a distant ridge. The figure was silhouetted against the setting sun, making it impossible to identify. But there was something familiar about the posture, the way the figure sat on the horse. "Jack," she whispered, her voice urgent.
"Look."
Jack followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He reached for his binoculars, focusing on the distant figure. His face paled. "It's him," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's Brody." Josie felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. Her worst fears were confirmed. Brody had betrayed them. He had been tracking them all along, leading them into a trap. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack's eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "We fight," he said. "We're not going down without a fight." He dismounted, grabbing his rifle and taking cover behind some rocks. Josie followed suit, her own gun drawn, her heart pounding in her chest. They waited, their senses on high alert, their eyes fixed on the distant ridge. The figure on horseback slowly approached, the setting sun casting long shadows across the canyon floor. As the figure drew closer, Josie's heart sank. It wasn't Brody. It was a woman, an old woman, dressed in simple, homespun clothes. She was riding a mule, her face weathered and wrinkled, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Josie's own. Josie and Jack exchanged a look of confusion and relief. They had been wrong. It wasn't Brody. It was just an innocent traveler. They lowered their guns, their bodies relaxing slightly. But the tension remained, the fear, the doubt. They had been so sure, so convinced that Brody had betrayed them. Their paranoia, their suspicion, had almost led them to make a terrible mistake. The old woman rode past them, offering a weary smile and a nod. Josie and Jack watched her go, their hearts heavy with the weight of their near miss, the realization of how close they'd come to losing themselves, to succumbing to the darkness that surrounded them. As they sat by their campfire that night, Josie looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "We almost killed an innocent woman, Jack," she said, her voice low. "We almost became the very thing we're running from." Jack nodded, his expression contrite. He knew she was right. His fear, his paranoia, had almost cost them dearly. "I'm sorry, Josie," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I let my fear get the better of me. I almost lost you." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "It's all right, Jack," she said. "We all make mistakes. We're both scared. We're both running from something. But we need to trust each other. We need to trust in the love we have, in the future we're trying to build." His grip tightened on hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of determination. "You're right, Josie," he said. "We can't let fear control us. We need to be strong. For each other." The ghosts of what might have been a life free from fear, a life built on trust, haunted them. But the near-fatal mistake served as a harsh lesson, a wake-up call. They had been consumed by their past, by their fears, by their doubts. But they had also been given a second chance, a chance to learn from their mistakes, to choose a different path. A path of hope, a future built together. The incident forced them to confront their demons, to acknowledge the darkness within themselves, and to choose the light, the love, the trust that bound them together. Chapter 16. Riding towards an uncertain dawn. The near disaster in the canyon served as a turning point. Jack and Josie realized the destructive power of their fear and suspicion, the way it had almost cost them their lives, their love, their future. They made a conscious effort to be more trusting, more open, more supportive of each other. They knew they still had a long way to go, that the road ahead was still fraught with danger, but they were determined to face it together, with courage and with love. They continued their westward journey, their pace quickening, their spirits lifted by the promise of a new beginning. They followed Brody's map diligently, avoiding the main trails and settlements, sticking to the remote and desolate landscapes. The scenery began to change. The harsh, arid desert gave way to rolling hills, covered in lush green grasses and wildflowers. They saw signs of civilization, farms, ranches, and small, scattered settlements. They were getting closer to California, closer to their destination, closer to the life they had dreamed of. One evening, as they were camped near a small stream, they saw a light in the distance, the flickering glow of a campfire. They approached cautiously, their guns drawn, their senses on high alert. They found a small group of travelers, a family, huddled around a campfire. They were farmers, heading west, seeking a new life in the fertile valleys of California. They were wary of Jack and Josie at first, suspicious of their guns and their guarded demeanor. But Josie, with her gentle manner and her genuine concern, managed to ease their fears, to gain their trust. They shared their food, their stories, their hopes, and their dreams. The family, the Millers, were kind, generous, and resilient. They had faced their own hardships, their own losses, but they had never given up hope. They were an inspiration to Jack and Josie, a reminder that they were not alone, that there were others who shared their struggles, their dreams of a better future. The Millers offered to let Jack and Josie travel with them, to share their journey, to provide them with protection and companionship. It was a tempting offer, a chance to ease the burden of their solitary journey, to find strength in numbers. Jack and Josie discussed it, weighing the pros and cons. They were grateful for the offer, but they were also wary of trusting strangers again, of risking their hard-won freedom. They ultimately decided to decline the offer, politely and respectfully. They thanked the Millers for their kindness, their generosity, but explained that they needed to travel alone, that they had their own reasons for needing to remain discreet. The Millers understood, or at least they pretended to. They wished Jack and Josie well, offering them blessings and prayers for a safe journey. As Jack and Josie rode away, they felt a pang of regret, a sense of longing for the companionship, the safety, the normalcy that the Millers represented. But they knew they had made the right decision. They needed to reach their destination on their own, to prove to themselves that they could survive, that they could build a new life, without relying on anyone but each other. They rode on, towards an uncertain dawn, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. They were closer than ever to their destination, to the freedom they craved, to the life they had dreamed of. But they knew that the final leg of their journey would be the most challenging, the most dangerous. They were riding towards a future that was still unwritten, a future that would test their courage, their resilience, their love. But they were ready. They were together. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm of Betrayal. As they neared the California border, the landscape transformed dramatically. Towering redwood forests replaced the arid plains, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The change was both invigorating and unsettling, a symbol of the new life they sought, but also a reminder of how far they were from the familiar harshness of their past. One evening, while scouting a path through a dense forest, Jack noticed something amiss. Fresh horse tracks, too many for a small group of travelers, crisscrossed the trail. The ground was disturbed, branches broken, as if a large group had recently passed through, and not carefully. "This doesn't feel right," Jack muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his gun.
Too much activity.
Too careless. Josie, too, felt the prickle of unease. "Could it be the vultures?" she asked, her voice low. Jack shook his head. "They wouldn't be this far west. And they'd be more cautious. This feels different." They decided to circle back, to find a higher vantage point to observe the area. As they climbed a rocky outcrop, they heard voices, faint at first, then growing louder. They crept closer, peering through the trees. Below them, in a small clearing, was a large encampment. But it wasn't the Crimson Vultures. It was a group of men, heavily armed, dressed in a mix of civilian clothes and what looked like remnants of Union Army uniforms. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly preparing for something big. And then Josie saw him. Sheriff Brody. He was standing in the center of the camp, talking to the leader of the group, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and a cold, calculating gaze. Brody was animated, gesturing emphatically, clearly in the midst of a heated discussion. Josie's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. Brody, their friend, their protector, was here, with what appeared to be a band of outlaws, or worse, rogue soldiers. Jack gripped her arm, his eyes narrowed. "What is it?" he whispered. "What do you see?" "It's Brody," she whispered back, her voice trembling.
"He's with them."
Jack cursed under his breath. His earlier suspicions, the ones he had dismissed, were now confirmed. Brody had betrayed them. He had played them all along. As they watched, the discussion between Brody and the leader of the group grew more intense. They couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. There was disagreement, conflict. Suddenly, the leader raised his hand, silencing Brody. He said something, his voice sharp and commanding. Brody flinched, his expression turning from defiance to resignation. The leader then turned to the rest of the men, addressing them in a loud voice. Josie and Jack still couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. He was giving orders, preparing them for action. Josie felt a wave of despair wash over her. Brody's betrayal cut deep, deeper than she had expected. She had trusted him, had believed in his goodness. Now, she realized that she had been a fool. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice urgent. "They'll be moving soon, and we don't want to be anywhere near them when they do." They retreated, carefully retracing their steps, their hearts pounding in their chests. They rode for hours, pushing their horses to their limits, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Brody's camp. The gathering storm of betrayal had broken. The truth, as ugly and painful as it was, had been revealed. Brody, the man they had trusted, was not who he seemed to be. And they were once again alone, caught in a web of deceit and danger, their dream of a new life threatened by the shadows of their past and the treachery of those they had believed to be their friends. The idyllic landscape, the promise of California, now seemed tainted, a cruel mockery of their hopes. They were running again, not just from the law, but from a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet wound. Chapter 18. When Trust Becomes a Deadly Gamble. They rode until dawn, exhaustion and despair threatening to overwhelm them. They found a secluded spot, a small cave hidden behind a waterfall, and collapsed, their bodies aching, their minds reeling. Josie couldn't stop replaying the scene she had witnessed, Brody's face, his gestures, the way he had interacted with the leader of the outlaw band. She tried to make sense of it, to find some explanation, some justification for his actions. But there was none. He had betrayed them, plain and simple. "Why, Jack?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why would he do this?" "He helped us, he saved us." Jack shook his head, his expression grim. "He played us, Josie. He played us from the start. He gained our trust, learned our plans, and then he led us right into their hands." "But who are they?" Josie asked. "What do they want?" Jack paced restlessly, his hand never far from his gun.
"I don't know," he said.
"But they're organized.
Disciplined.
They're not just a ragtag bunch of outlaws. There's something more, something worse." He speculated that they might be remnants of a Confederate unit, refusing to accept defeat, planning some kind of uprising, some act of rebellion against the Union. Or perhaps they were simply mercenaries, hired by someone with a vested interest in stopping them, in preventing them from reaching California. Josie remembered her father's letter, his threat to ruin Jack, to prevent him from ever being with her. Could he be behind this? Could he have hired Brody, these men, to track them down, to bring her back? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She had thought she had escaped her father's control, his manipulative grip. But now, she realized that she might never be truly free. "We need to figure out their plan," Jack said, his voice determined. "We need to know what they're up to. And then we need to stop them." Josie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was still an outlaw, a man with a price on his head. But he was also a man of courage, a man of honor, a man who was willing to fight for what he believed in, for the woman he loved.
"How?"
she asked. "How can we stop them? We're just two people. They're an army." Jack smiled, a grim, determined smile. "We have something they don't have, Josie," he said. "We have each other. And we have the element of surprise. They think we're running. They think we're scared. They don't expect us to fight back." He outlined a plan, a daring, dangerous plan that involved infiltrating their camp, gathering information, and then taking them down one by one, using their knowledge of the terrain, their skills, their wits. It was a long shot, a gamble, a desperate attempt to turn the tables on their pursuers. But they had nothing left to lose. They had lost their trust, their security, their hope of a peaceful future. All they had left was each other, and their determination to survive. Trust, once a given, had become a deadly gamble. They had trusted Brody, and he had betrayed them. Now they could only trust each other, their instincts, their love. They were entering a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were their lives, their freedom, their future. But they were ready. They were together. And they would fight. The betrayal had shattered their illusions, but it had also forged a new strength, a new resolve. They would not be victims. They would be warriors. They would face the storm, head on, and they would fight for their right to live, to love, to be free. The cave, a temporary refuge, became a symbol of their resilience, their determination to survive, to overcome the odds, to reclaim their destiny. Chapter 19. In the Valley of Reckoning and Redemption. Under the cover of darkness, Jack and Josie returned to the outlaw camp. They moved like shadows, silent and unseen, their senses on high alert. They had spent the day observing the camp from a distance, studying the layout, the routines, the movements of the men. They had formulated a plan, a risky, desperate plan that relied on stealth, surprise, and a healthy dose of luck. Their goal was twofold: to gather information about Brody's intentions and the group's plans, and to sabotage their operation, to disrupt their preparations, to give themselves a fighting chance. They crept closer to the camp, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the occasional murmur of voices. Jack signaled Josie to stay hidden while he moved closer to the center of the camp, where Brody and the leader were likely to be. He blended into the shadows, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. Josie watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She knew the risks he was taking, the danger he was facing. But she also knew that he was doing it for her, for them, for their future. She waited, her senses on high alert, her gun drawn and ready. She scanned the perimeter of the camp, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. After what seemed like an eternity, Jack returned, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "They're planning to attack a nearby town," he whispered. "A small settlement called Harmony Creek. They're going to rob the bank, steal supplies, and then kill anyone who gets in their way." Josie's blood ran cold. Harmony Creek was a peaceful community, a place where farmers, ranchers, and families lived in relative harmony. It was the kind of place they had dreamed of finding, of settling down in, of building a new life. "We have to stop them, Jack," she said, her voice urgent. "We have to warn them." Jack nodded.
I know, but we need to be smart about it.
"We can't just ride in there, guns blazing. We need a plan." They discussed their options, their minds racing, their hearts pounding. They decided to split up. Jack would stay behind, sabotaging the camp, delaying their departure, giving Josie time to reach Harmony Creek and warn the townspeople. It was a dangerous plan, a separation that neither of them wanted, but they knew it was their only chance. They embraced, a long, desperate embrace that conveyed their love, their fear, their commitment to each other. "Be careful, Josie," Jack whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You too, Jack," she replied, her eyes filled with tears. She mounted her horse and rode off, disappearing into the darkness, her heart heavy with fear and determination. Jack watched her go, his own heart filled with a mixture of love and dread. He turned back to the camp, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had a job to do. He had to delay them, to disrupt their plans, to give Josie a chance to save the innocent people of Harmony Creek. He would do whatever it took, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. The Valley of Reckoning and Redemption had become their battleground. The choices they made, the actions they took, would determine not only their own fate, but the fate of an entire community. They were fighting for more than just their own survival. They were fighting for justice, for peace, for the right to live free from fear and oppression. They were fighting for a future that was still within their grasp, a future that they were determined to claim, no matter the cost. The separation was agonizing, but it was a testament to their courage, their love, their unwavering commitment to each other and to the innocent lives at stake. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Josie rode through the night, pushing her horse to its limits, her mind focused on one thing, reaching Harmony Creek and warning the townspeople. The image of the peaceful settlement, the innocent faces of the people she had met on her journey, fueled her determination.
She had to get there in time.
She had to save them. As she approached the town, she saw the first signs of dawn breaking on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, but it also filled her with dread. Time was running out. She rode into the town, her horse lathered and exhausted, her own body aching with fatigue. She shouted a warning, her voice hoarse and desperate. "They're coming. Outlaws. They're going to attack." The townspeople, startled awake by her cries, emerged from their homes, their faces filled with confusion and fear. Josie quickly explained the situation, telling them about Brody, about the outlaw band, about their plan to rob the bank and kill anyone who stood in their way. At first, they were skeptical, disbelieving. But Josie's desperate pleas, her genuine concern, and the urgency in her voice convinced them. They rallied, organizing themselves, preparing to defend their town. They barricaded the streets, armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, and waited. The tension was palpable, the silence broken only by the nervous whispers of the townspeople and the distant sound of approaching horses. Meanwhile, Jack had done his work. He had sabotaged the outlaw camp, disabling their horses, scattering their supplies, and setting fire to their ammunition wagons. He had created chaos and confusion, delaying their departure and giving Josie the time she needed. But he had also been discovered. He was captured, beaten, and tied up, awaiting his fate at the hands of the enraged outlaw leader. As the outlaws finally reached Harmony Creek, they found themselves facing not a defenseless town, but a determined and well-prepared resistance. The townspeople, armed and ready, fought back with a ferocity that surprised and overwhelmed the attackers. The battle was fierce and bloody. Gunfire echoed through the streets, screams of pain and anger filled the air. Josie fought alongside the townspeople, her Colt peacemaker blazing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. She saw Brody, his face twisted with rage and betrayal, leading the attack. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. She saw the flicker of regret in his eyes, the shadow of the man he once was. But it was too late. He had made his choice. Josie raised her gun, her finger tightening on the trigger. She hesitated, her heart torn between the memory of their friendship and the reality of his betrayal. Before she could fire, a shot rang out. Brody stumbled, clutching his chest, his eyes widening in surprise. He collapsed to the ground, dead. Josie lowered her gun, her body trembling. She hadn't fired the shot. She looked around, searching for the shooter. She saw Jack. He was standing on the roof of the bank, his rifle smoking, his face grim and determined. He had escaped, somehow, and he had arrived just in time. With Brody dead and their leader gone, the remaining outlaws lost their nerve. They scattered, fleeing in disarray, their attack thwarted, their plans ruined. The townspeople cheered, their voices hoarse with relief and triumph. They had defended their homes, their families, their lives. They had won. Josie and Jack found each other amidst the chaos, their eyes meeting across the battle-scarred street. They ran towards each other, embracing in a long, desperate hug. They were alive. They were together. And they were free. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had ended. The battle was over, the victory won. But the scars remained, the memories of betrayal and violence, the echoes of the past. They had faced their demons, their fears, their doubts. And they had emerged stronger, their love tested and proven, their bond unbreakable. The town they had saved, Harmony Creek, represented the future they had fought for, a future of peace, of community, of belonging. The dawn, breaking over the horizon, was a promise of a new beginning, a new life, built on the ashes of the past, forged in the fires of adversity and sustained by the enduring power of love. Epilogue. The dust settled in Harmony Creek, both literally and figuratively. The town, though scarred, began to rebuild, its spirit unbroken. Josie and Jack, no longer fugitives, were welcomed as heroes. They had saved the town, and in doing so, had found their own salvation. They stayed in Harmony Creek, making it their home. Jack, using the skills he had honed in a life of hardship, became a blacksmith, his strong hands shaping metal instead of wielding weapons. Josie, with her experience running the Desert Rose, opened a small general store, providing supplies and a sense of community to the townspeople. They built a life together, a simple life, a peaceful life, a life filled with love and purpose. They never forgot the past, the hardships they had endured, the betrayals they had suffered, the choices they had made. But they didn't dwell on it. They looked forward, towards the future, towards the possibilities that lay ahead. They often thought of Brody, his betrayal a lingering wound that would never fully heal. They tried to understand his motives, to make sense of his actions. But they never could. Some things they realized were simply beyond comprehension. Years passed. The seasons changed. The town thrived. Josie and Jack grew old together, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable. They watched children grow, families flourish, and the community prosper. They became an integral part of Harmony Creek, respected and beloved by all. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their small cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Josie reached for Jack's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We made it, Jack," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a lifetime of memories. He smiled, a slow, tender smile that warmed her heart. "We did, Josie," he replied. "We did." He leaned over and kissed her, a gentle, loving kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their journey. It was a kiss that whispered of a past filled with hardship and pain, but a future filled with hope and happiness. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast expanse of the night sky. They were home. They were at peace. They were together. And that was all that mattered. Their lives, once a whirlwind of chaos and danger, had found their calm center, their peaceful resolution. They had found redemption, not in escaping their past, but in confronting it, in overcoming it, in building a future that honored their love and their resilience. The end.